I'm really going to whiz through some of the sort of key issues around winter bean production. There are a number of things to get through from establishment right through to harvest, of course. And as Jane said, we'll be taking some questions at the end. So if you have anything you want to focus on a bit more, that's fine. Please send them through chat. And we'll answer those for you. So just a quick background on the area of field beans in general, although we're focusing on winter beans today. As you can see from this diagram, it's been quite variable. It tends to be quite cyclical, and we have provisional figures for 2020 showing that the area has increased, but of course we don't yet have yield figures for 2020. They are quite variable this year. I think winter bean yields in some cases have been difficult, and of course the season's not been the most straightforward season for many people, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So, end uses, there's quite a variety of end uses for field beans. About 30% of the UK market goes into human consumption. So these are the really good quality bean seeds with no bruchid damage or very little bruchid damage, no staining. So nice, clean, light coloured beans. The rest goes into animal feed mainly in one form or another. So it's ruminants and non-ruminants, both. Beans go into both of those types of animal compound feed. And also there's quite a large developing market for salmon feed as well. So this is in Scotland and the Scandinavian countries. And there's a few new developments such as bean beer, which some of you may have tried either at cereals or at our road shows. So a variety of end uses, and so we would say there's always an end use for field beans. Winter beans are suitable for the human consumption market as well because of the large seeded nature of them. As Jane mentioned, there's a number of benefits in the rotation of including beans. We do look at beans as a rotational crop really. So certainly when we're looking at gross margins, we would say look at beans in the rotation as opposed to just a single crop sometimes, although obviously even as an individual crop they can be quite profitable. But they are a source of homegrown protein, and as a rule between 26 and 30% grain protein content compared to soy, which is 45%, but they are homegrown. They're also GM free, of course, so big benefit to that. Nitrogen fixing is a key benefit. So not only are you reducing mineral fertiliser input in the actual bean crop itself, and in many areas, of course, or most areas of the UK are in an NVZ, so Nmax is 0, which means you can apply no nitrogen fertiliser. But they are reported to give very good yield benefits to the following cereal crops, so anywhere between 0.6 and 0.9 tonnes per hectare. And a result of the reduced mineral and fertiliser input into those crops, we do see huge reductions in energy use and carbon emissions. So beneficial from that point of view. They have real benefits for soil structure, particularly winter beans that can be deep rooting crops. And the relationship between the root exudates and the soil rhizosphere is beneficial for microbial populations as well. So that's something that should be borne in mind really with winter beans and spring beans. They have non-N pre-crop benefits as well. So they do help release phosphorus and potassium for following crops. And as I said, gross margins of legume rotations often exceed those of non-legume rotations because of the lower inputs and positive pre-crop effects. Additional benefits, you do get disease breaks for cereals and oilseed rape. They spread the workload, particularly, of course, winter beans, because you're drilling later. And the benefit of drilling later also impacts on your weed control. And harvest tends to be a little bit later than most of the crops. So workload can be spread across the year better. And quite a large proportion of growers, really, probably 20% of growers are maybe growing field beans from on-farm protein for animal feed, either as crimped grains or as a forage crop or silage crop. The benefits on mixed farms can be greater because you do get a return of nutrients, of course. So And finally, really, or amongst others, they offer a really good opportunity for pollinating beneficial insects, and bumblebees and solitary bees particularly. The late season nature of the crop, to a certain extent, if weed control isn't perfect, can give the opportunity for some flowering weed species for pollinators as well. So lots of benefits in the rotation. Advantages of winter beans over spring beans. On heavier soil types, it might be easier to establish crops in the autumn rather than trying to get them in spring beans in a wet spring. They have the advantage of being able to access winter moisture as well. So, of course, by the time we get into the spring, and certainly for the last few years where we've experienced drought conditions in the spring, winter beans often perform better, and they often yield better than spring beans because they have access to more moisture. So they're more robust to spring and summer drought. And certainly they are less susceptible to weevil damage because they're better established, they have a better established root system. So in most cases, we don't really think that weevil control in winter beans is necessary. As I said, they tend to yield more than spring beans, and they're more tolerant to cold winter conditions. So they can be tolerant down to about -10 or below, compared to spring beans, which are tolerant to about -6. Winter hardening is important. We don't always get adequate winter hardening conditions, but they are more frost tolerant, certainly when they've had a period of winter hardening. This season, I'm going to talk about this briefly. We all know it's not been the easiest of seasons. So we had a very wet autumn in 2019, excuse me, which meant that winter beans were either not drilled at all, or they went into early 2020. We also saw, we saw winter beans drilled in the spring, and we know that they can be drilled into January reasonably easily with the new varieties. Later than that, we know that we need to start increasing seed rates in winter beans to get almost equivalent yields to spring beans, but they don't yield as well as a winter bean drilled in the autumn. The other issue we saw in this season was the issue of some volunteer crops. Firstly, that it wasn't possible to remove because of the conditions in the autumn, and a lack of options really. So some volunteer crops were left. It's certainly not something we'd encourage, and we are keeping an eye on the situation with that to see how they perform. But back-to-back cropping isn't ideal, of course, because of disease pressure. So in terms of cultivations and establishment, there's a few options really. Drilling obviously can be difficult in wet conditions, but this is what most people are doing now, and it does achieve optimum establishment and drilling depth. So optimum drilling depth is about 3 inches, 12.5 centimetres. Many people are starting to use min-till and direct drilling. Just make sure that seed's well covered and the coulters don't leave open slots for a couple of reasons really. One is herbicide use following drilling, and also birds, particularly rooks and crows, removing seed where there's open slots. So you do need good seed to soil contact for moisture uptake. Ploughing in, not used that much anymore. It's a traditional method and it's used in difficult conditions when soil moisture is high, but it has some disadvantages. Excess straw can lead to anaerobic conditions. We do get a lot of variation in drilling depth and emergence and productivity really with ploughing in. Suitable for some farms, but I think most people are drilling now. And seed beds need to be levelled out ideally to assist in weed control. So when it comes to factors that are likely to cause excuse me, yield variability to a large extent, I would say the key one is establishment, and it's particularly around the issue of soil structure. So we know for legumes and pulses in particular that soil structure and particularly compaction is one of the key issues that affects crop development. So this is an issue that really needs to be dealt with before drilling and throughout the rotation. Compaction certainly reduces root development and can reduce yields by up to 40% or more. And you can see if you look at the top picture there, the roots on those beans are going sideways. So inevitably, they're not going to have access to soil moisture. So where we have soil moisture deficits, and particularly over the last few years during the spring, the restriction of the roots causes severe moisture stress and actually the inability to take up nutrients. So the other side of this, of course, is waterlogging. So winter field beans in general are quite tolerant to waterlogged conditions for a few days, but if it goes on for longer than that, then it causes irreversible damage to the root system and the plants will die. So the soil structure, as far as we're concerned, is a key issue around yield stability, and it's something that needs to be addressed for all crops, really. One of the things that we know as well about difficulties with soil structure is it leads to much higher levels of soil-borne pathogen infection. So here we're talking about the foot rots and the stem rots, particularly Fusarium and Sclerotinia. So Fusarium is a disease that affects the roots and the base of the stem and causes plant death, and under very difficult conditions of high stress, particularly when compaction is in the soil structure, foot rots are more of a problem. Other factors affect foot rot infections. Soil structure was the key one, really. Rotation. So when we talk about legume rotations, we consider all sort of large-seeded legumes as the same crop. So no one of them should be grown more than 1 in 5 years, and that's quite important to prevent disease buildup. Some of the pathogens cross-infect between different legume crops, so that's quite important. If you've had a long history of bean production or legume production, it's likely that you're going to have a higher pathogen burden. And as I said, conditions at establishment are really important. Our key message in terms of establishment is wait for the right conditions. Don't force beans in. It inevitably leads to problems, and in really difficult conditions can cause very significant yield impact. So high plant stress leads to greater disease pressure. Foot rot diseases, it's important to prevent them from happening actually in the first place, because there are no ways of controlling them, no chemical means to control it at the moment. So prevention is key. Sowing and seed rate. Optimal sowing time for winter beans is mid-October to late November. Seed rates vary a bit now. Recommendations have changed slightly, and Sonova do produce a really good winter bean growers guide, which gives you seed rates for specific varieties. For Tundra, which is a Lima grain variety, we recommend 20 to 22 plants per square metre. So do have a look at the Sonova Winter Bean Guide. It's a very good sort of short summary of how to grow winter beans. Allow 10 to 15% field loss over the winter when you're calculating your seed rate, and you'll be using your 1,000 seed weight, field loss, germination capacity to calculate seed rates. And you can use the PGRO app to calculate a seed rate and for further information. So the PGRO app is our agronomy guide, and you can just download that from Google or Apple stores. We do have some data for winter beans sown in the spring, and we also have data for spring beans sown in the autumn now. If anybody has any questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. Recommended list is published each year, and for winter beans, the data come from 7 sites. This is available on the website, so you can download the tables or look at the tables on the website, and also, of course, the varietal information is available on the app as well. And they just give you the sort of characteristics of each of the varieties in terms of standing ability, shortness of straw, and maturity. So moving on, once you've selected a variety and you've got your soil conditions right, seed quality, of course, is the next critical issue. It's really important, whether you're buying seed or farm-saving seed, to make sure it's been tested for germination capacity, seed-borne pests and diseases. So for germination capacity, we would say in an ideal world, it should be 80% or more. And the reason for this is that once we start to see germination capacity dropping below 80%, the effect in the field is not always a one-to-one effect. So germination capacity is tested in ideal conditions. When we drop below 80%, and depending on the reason for the drop in germination capacity, so if it's physical damage, for instance, either by bruchid or over-dry seed, it can often have a greater effect in the field where conditions are more difficult, and vigour of the plants can be less, certainly when physical damage is sustained to the seed. So really important to check that. Stem nematode is probably the key seed-borne pest, and it has it's seed-borne and soil-borne. So the key about this is it can affect yields quite dramatically in a difficult wet spring and early summer. And it can stay in soils for up to 10 years. So it's a long-term problem once you have it. So it's really important to check that seed is free of stem nematode. If you look at the picture at the bottom of the slide there, you can see a seed sample that's affected quite badly by stem nematode. So it's affecting yield, but it's also affecting the seed quality or the grain quality. So as you can see from that, that wouldn't be suitable for human consumption either. And every time you plant infected seed back into the soil, numbers of stem nematodes increase. Once you have it in the soil, you do need to leave a period of 10 years before you go back in with beans. In most cases, it is largely the bean stem nematode that affects them. There is another species of stem nematode that affects beans that has a wider host range, but it's not as common. In terms of diseases, Ascochyta fabi is a seed-borne disease. It's also found in bean trash and spread from surrounding crops, but it's not commonly seen actually in winter beans anymore, largely because it's been screened out of seed. We have a foliar treatment for Ascochyta, but we don't have a seed treatment, so have seed tested. If it's more than 1% Ascochyta infected, don't use it. Do consider moisture content of seed and physical damage. As I said, they can have quite an impact on germination capacity, and every time you move the seed, especially at low moisture contents, you can often see quite considerable loss in germination capacity. So really important to look after seed quality. Weed control, here I've just given a few examples of possible herbicide programs. So Nirvana is a broad spectrum herbicide, and you can add Centium for cleaver control. There's options such as Stomp Aqua, which is pendimethalin, up to 2.9 litres per hectare, and again Centium for cleaver control, or Defy, which is a reasonably broad spectrum herbicide as well. Those are your pre-em options. Post-em is limited in terms of broad-leafed weed control. So Bazagran can be used post-emergence, and use stewardship guidance, because Bazagran is one of the active substances that is frequently found in groundwater. When it comes to blackgrass control, certainly use all of the cultural means that you have at your disposal to try and reduce blackgrass populations. We are fortunate with winter beans that we do have a couple of products that currently show the blackgrass currently shows no resistance to, and that is Curb and Crawler. So those can be used, Curb can be used pre-emergence, and Crawler up to the end of February, and both pre-emergence and post-emergence. And then again, follow up with Bazagran for broadleaf weed control. So we do have a few options in winter beans that perhaps not available in other crops that will give you some blackgrass control. For disease control, we've talked about Ascochyta, so I'm really going to focus on the two key diseases, which are chocolate spot and rust. These are the ones you're really going to see in field beans under the right conditions, and the ones that we would say are the most likely ones that you'll need to control. So chocolate spot is a very common pathogen. It's botrytis, so it's really commonly present. It'll either spread from volunteers, crop debris, or surrounding crops. The first thing you're likely to see is small chocolate-coloured spots on the leaves. Under the right conditions, which are basically wet weather, really, those lesions coalesce quite quickly and form larger lesions which can take over the whole leaf and eventually lead to defoliation. The other thing that happens is you get sclerotia forming in the stems, and these will be returned to the soil, so that's another source. The spores are released from the sclerotia and go back into volunteers and overwintering crops, and particularly winter beans. Chocolate spot in winter beans is more of a problem, certainly, because they do sometimes sustain some physical damage from frost in the winter, which leads them to be more open to chocolate spot. And of course, they're exposed to the right conditions for a longer period as well. We did some work. Don't worry too much about the detail of this figure. What it shows is we did some work with Signum actually a few years ago, looking at timing for chocolate spot sprays. The key thing to take home from this slide really is that if you miss, so T1 is early flowering, T2 was first pod application of Signum, and T3 is 3 to 4 weeks after first pod. What came out of this trial really was that if you miss the first pod application, chocolate spot control becomes much more difficult. So key messages for chocolate spot management: winter beans are much more susceptible. And it's notable, particularly if you're drilling early. So if you're drilling before the middle of October and you've got high population density, they are much more prone to chocolate spot infections, which spread through the crop much more quickly in a dense crop. Preventative spraying is essential when conditions are suitable because we don't have any curative products. And excuse me, with winter beans, most likely you're going to end up spraying probably from early flowering onwards, but between early flowering and first pod. It's unlikely that you will need to go much earlier than that, hopefully in most seasons. Second spray 3 to 4 weeks later with a product that's active against rust, and I'll talk about rust in a minute. In terms of product activity, azoxystrobin, we see clear dose responses with azoxystrobin, so the higher the rate, the better the control. Signum is a really good product for chocolate spot management, gives good control at 0.7 kilos per hectare, and also gives good yield responses in trials. And I think part of that is because Signum can keep the plants green for longer. So we have seen up to 17% yield responses with Signum applications compared to, for instance, an azoxystrobin and tebuconazole mixture, which is good and gives equivalent chocolate spot control, but the yield response is slightly lower, partly because of this greening effect of Signum. Bean rust is a slightly different type of disease, of course. It forms these orange pustules on the leaves and spreads very rapidly under the right conditions. It's a warm weather disease, so we tend to see this later on in crop development as the weather warms up, and particularly when we have cool nights. So actually this year we did see that really in July, and rust spread very quickly through some crops where it wasn't controlled. Again, it needs to be a preventative applications really, because there aren't any curative products for rust either. You're likely to be looking at spraying from the end of flowering. For both diseases, I suppose, once the pods are completely full, then further fungicide applications don't have very much effect on yield. There's a good product choice for rust as well. And again, we did the same work with Signum, looking at timing, and don't worry too much about the detail, but it was very clear from the timing trials that we got the greatest benefit both to disease control and yields, which are the red dots at the top there, from that last application in winter beans. So an overall fungicide programme for the diseases we've talked about. If ascochyta is present, which is much less common, then you do need to include azoxystrobin at full rate in the first chocolate spot spray, and you may need to go a little bit earlier. But really you're talking at the T1, so that would be likely to be in your T1 treatment with chocolate spot, early flowering to first pod. And there's a number of choices, and then obviously since the loss of chlorothalonil, we no longer have Alto Elite, which was a reasonably standard choice for many people, or SAN 703 or similar product. But fortunately, we're in a position with beans really that we do have some choices for fungicides that are as effective, in fact, more effective in some cases. So Signum or azoxystrobin plus tebuconazole, which is good for chocolate spot. You can swap the tebuconazole for metconazole. We also have cyprodinil plus fludeoxonil, which is effective for chocolate spot management, and that's switch. For T2, you are looking to start incorporating your rust control, so it'll be 3 to 4 weeks after your T1, and Signum and azoxystrobin plus tebuconazole will give you good rust control as well as good chocolate spot control. It seems to be the case actually in many years that 3 applications might be necessary in winter beans, and it's certainly more common practice for people to do 3 applications for fungicides. And again, you can use those products that we've described in your T2 particularly. So again, you're looking at rust as being the key key issue at this T3 stage. Moving on to pests, I'm really going to talk about the two key issues, I suppose, for beans really. Aphids is the first, and bruchid beetle, of course, being the second. So in terms of pest monitoring and forecasting, there are a couple of tools available to people that you can use. AHDB produce Aphid News, which is a really good resource for first flights of aphids. So if you look at that, it does it for all crops, so it's not just peas and beans. It'll tell you when first flights are occurring, and it's the data are taken from suction trap catches across the whole of the UK, so it's based on where you are, and you can see what's happening in terms of aphid flight. So well worth looking at that. We put it on our website, and AHDB, of course, send it out to people that sign up for it, and also it can be found on their website as well. So a really useful resource for predicting when aphids are likely to be moving into crops. The other resource for pest monitoring and forecasting for beans is the Bruchid Cast, which is a Syngenta tool that predicts spray dates based on the weather forecast. So it's predicting the timing of spraying for bruchid really, and that starts at the beginning of May. So it is appropriate for beans as well, because of course they're like winter beans, they're likely to be setting pods slightly earlier than spring beans, so sign up for that as well, and that will flag up when spraying is likely to be required. So for aphid species in beans, the two main ones are black bean aphid and pea aphid. Black bean aphid has a wide host range, so it includes a number of other crop hosts as well as some weed hosts. It tends to cause damage in beans more really from direct feeding damage rather than virus infection. So it's not a great virus vector. The other real issue that we see with black bean aphid is that it encourages chocolate spot infection because of the honeydew that's left on the plant. So it's important, and black bean aphid forms large colonies from the top of the plant downwards. So it's quite easy to see in crops. But most of the damage done from that pest is via direct feeding. Pea aphid, on the other hand, that's a different matter. It can form large colonies in beans, tends not to in most years, but it will do sometimes. Its key form of damage is through virus transmission. So it can transmit up to 30 viruses in crops across the world. In beans, it transmits viruses such as peonation mosaic virus, bean leaf roll virus, and it's probably going to do more damage to bean crops from a virus transmission point of view. Which leads us on to the next slide, which we do have some difficulties at the moment with insecticides in winter beans. We have a number of pyrethroids that are available in winter beans to control pests in general, but of course the pyrethroids are not going to have a huge impact on aphid populations, but they can be incorporated in a programme to help to keep aphid numbers lower. A couple of those that you can see there shouldn't be used during flowering. Harvest intervals vary quite a bit on the pyrethroids, so you really do need to check those and check the number of applications permitted. But there are some that can be used during flowering as well, so deltamethrin, S-fenvalerate and lambda. The only proper aphicide that we currently have in field beans is perimicarb, which is aphox, and maximum rate is 280 grams per hectare, 14-day harvest interval. But the significant thing about aphox is it has one application only, so it means that we're restricted currently in terms of how we manage viruses. So viruses tend to be transmitted into crops quite early on, and particularly by pea aphid, and often actually by the pea aphid that you're not seeing. So it'll be in low numbers of pea aphids that are on the undersides of leaves. So it can be a difficult decision to make, and certainly because we, of course, in any year never know what the weather's going to do, we don't know how colonies will build up throughout the season. Our inclination at the moment is to say, save the aphox for your large colonies to prevent feeding damage. But if you know that you always have really difficulties with virus infection, then it may be that you decide to use that earlier to prevent virus infection. We hope that we'll have other products available for next year for aphid control, which will help us to manage the virus issues. There are some biological control products available, so ladybirds and predatory wasps are actual products that you can buy to use in crops, and there are some organic surfactants and plant extracts that can be used as well to help manage some of the issues. But of course, there are things you can do on farm. You can encourage natural enemies by using your non-crop areas. And there's some research from Europe that shows that intercropping can help with some pest problems by dilution and barrier. And certainly for some pests, we are starting to look at the use of trap cropping as a means to manage some of our more difficult pests, and bruchid is one of those. So when we move on to bruchid, many of you will be very familiar with this pest. It's a small beetle that emerges in sort of late spring, really. So we're talking mid-April when it starts to move into crops. Females feed on flowers of beans, and of course winter beans are likely to be the ones that are flowering first, so they will probably move into winter beans first, lay eggs on pods, and then the larvae feed inside the seed and emerge around harvest time to leave a large hole in the seed. And the issue with bruchid beetle is, of course, the damage to the seed. The new generation that's emerged from the seed then move into overwintering sites, and then they'll emerge the following spring. So this causes, certainly in most of the south of England, difficulties for human consumption, quality, and it's quite a difficult pest to manage, really. We've had a sort of series of summers where the temperature in June has been such that this problem has been quite high in bean crops. It's very temperature dependent, and we know that when we have prolonged periods of temperatures above 20 degrees C, that damage is significantly higher, certainly from Yorkshire downwards in crops. So our advice at the moment is when you've had 2 consecutive days at 20 degrees C, that's when your first application should go on, but only if crops have set their first pod. So this is when about 50% of pods on the bottom trusses are at 2 centimetres, and then apply a second spray 7 days later. We've had the benefit this year that we had thiacloprid available in crops, which is a good product for bruchid control in beans, so that's Biscaya, but we won't have that next year. So we are back to pyrethroids for bruchid management. Use of nozzles can give you some better penetration into the bottom of the crop. We know angled nozzles such as the Amistar nozzle do perform well, and also Lechler ID3 drift reduction nozzles give good control. Water volume, at least 100 litres per hectare. We would prefer it really if you were closer to 200 litres per hectare for bruchid management. It just gives you better coverage of the crop and better crop penetration. So, and also we've mentioned the predictions and the forecast that you can get from Syngenta as well. So when it comes to harvesting, we have had an emergency off-label approval this year for Spotlight Plus as a desiccant for seed crops only, because we're in a position now with the loss of dicot that we have only glyphosate available in pulses as a desiccant. And it can't be used on seed crops because it affects germination capacity. What I would say, though, about winter beans is as long as the crops are weed-free, you shouldn't normally need to desiccate them. So often the leaves will have fallen during ripening, and the desiccants that we have don't really have that much effect on the stems. So as long as the crop's weed-free, a desiccant shouldn't be necessary. Glyphosate doesn't bring the crop on, and it's really for weed control, not desiccation. As I say, we may not have Spotlight next year anyway. The approval this year ends next week. When it comes to moisture content, beans can be fit to combine at 18% moisture content, but do wait until only a few stems are green. If you're planning to store beans for a long period of time, then you really need to get moisture content down to 14%, and in order to prevent any development of moulds. Also good to store beans. They are quite prone to discoloration due to light levels, so you need to store them in the dark if possible if you're going to store them for a long term to prevent them discolouring, particularly if you're planning them to go for human consumption. Finally, just a couple of tools that are available. We have an agronomy tool for field beans that can be requested. So if you go onto our website and go to the OptiBean agronomy tool, you can request to be sent a version of the OptiBean tool, which is a spreadsheet-based tool that can give you enter your own information about seed price, target population, fungicide application. So there's a number of different aspects to this tool, and it's really helpful, I think, for a lot of people to give them some advice about agronomy, seed rates, etc. We also have the app, which you can download onto your smartphones. Please make use of that. There's a lot of information on there that you can access, as well as from our website as well. And we're really trying to encourage people now to take part in the Yield Enhancement Network. So the Bean Yield Enhancement Network has just come to the end of its second year. We're really looking for growers to join the YEN going forwards. It's not a competition in our case. We really are looking to benchmark and to really provide information to growers that can help them make the best from beans. So please, if you're interested in the YEN, please contact us directly. And finally, just to say thanks for listening. I hope this has been of some use, and obviously I'll happily take some questions now. I also have a colleague here sitting at a good social distance from me who may be able to answer some of your questions as well. If you want further information, go to our website or email me directly. We do run an advisory service and a plant clinic, which are both free to growers who are growing peas or beans. Our seed testing laboratory is available as well. That's a charged for service. And all our publications and updates are available on the website. So.
Thank you very much for that, Becky. Excellent presentation. Like I say, it was a very whistle-stop tour, high-level view. So if you do have any more detailed questions, please feel free to use the chat function to pose them to us. We will just wait for Becky to reconnect. Here we are.
There we go.
Becky, thank you.
Hi.
So thank you very much for that fantastic presentation. I learned a lot. So we have a couple of questions. Yep. So first of all, one from Eloise. Is it worth spraying for bruchid beetles if known resistance in field? Do you also have any experience with garlic sprays, and if these are effective?
We've not looked at garlic sprays, no. I think that it's a really good question actually about bruchid beetle spraying. There is some suggestion that there is some resistance to pyrethroid products now in the bruchid populations. We know as well that there are other factors that affect the effectiveness of the pyrethroids. One is the weather, of course, so the hotter it is, the less effective they are, or the less persistent they are. But I think the valid question is it worth spraying? And certainly for some areas where you know you consistently get high levels of bruchid damage in crops, I would say it's almost better to target a different end use, actually. It's until we have more effective products or other cultural means, trap cropping, for instance, which may offer us some benefits. We certainly know, and the reason we sort of started looking at trap cropping is because we know there are some big differences between earlier sown spring beans, for instance. So we know that there are differences in from a temporal point of view in how bruchids attack crops. What we're hoping to do with the trap crops is attract those early emerging bruchids into a trap crop and keep them there and try and keep them out of the crop. So we're looking at a number of cultural techniques to try and manage the problem, and we will be starting to look now at the biological control products and things like garlic. So we have looked at one or two other types of products, but not specifically garlic for bruchid management.
Okay, so watch this space. Thank you. We've got some of the questions coming through now. If you do have any, like I say, if you're thinking of it, other people are likely to be thinking of the question as well. So as Colin says, don't be shy. So we have a question here with regards to varieties and seed rates. So with stiffer, shorter varieties entering the market recently, PGRO have been advocating higher seed rates for some varieties. What are the main advantages of higher seed rates, and where should they be used / not be used?
Specifically winter beans, I guess, in this case, isn't it? Yeah, I think that, I mean, the
Yes.
advantage of the higher seed rates is yield benefit. I think in the end, that's really where the benefit is seen. And with the stiffer, shorter varieties, you don't get that added problem of lodging, of course, which you can get with the taller varieties in terms of the higher population. So the benefit really is in yield and gross margins in the end.
Great, thank you.
The varietal information is specific, just to go back to the question about where they should be used. As I said, the variety information is specifically given in over. So for each variety, they'll tell you what the optimum plant density target population should be.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Okay, we have a question now with regards to oats. Any problems with oats in the rotation in relation to nematodes?
Potentially, but not always. I think going back to stem nematode, the most commonly occurring species of stem nematode is pretty much the bean stem nematode. So there's two species, Ditelenchus gigas, which mainly affects beans, and Ditelenchus dipsaki, which affects a broad host range. Dipsaki, we think, is probably only present in about 5 to 10% of cases. If it is present, then yes, having oats in the rotation is likely to maintain populations in the soil. We actually can test now, though, both seed and soil for the presence of either of those species. So we can tell you what species you have present on your farm using molecular tests. So that's available to growers now. So hopefully in most cases not, but definitely certainly in probably 5 to 10% of cases could be an issue.
Okay, great. I have a question actually that I was curious about. With regards to the work that you've done with spring beans sown in the autumn, could you expand a little bit more on that in terms of optimum sowing rates and what kind of yield penalty farmers can expect with that autumn sowing of spring bean varieties?
Spring bean. Yeah, so spring beans in the autumn, the work was done on two populations. It was done at 40 plants per square metre and 20 plants per square metre, which is obviously closer to what you'd be drilling your winter bean varieties at. There's a yield penalty, certainly from drilling spring beans at 20 plants per square metre, but at 40 plants per square metre in the autumn, which is the population that you'd be sowing spring beans in the spring, actually they often yielded as well, they yielded as well as and sometimes better than the winter beans.
Okay, good. So good option due to the seed shortage.
It's not, to be honest, it's not something we necessarily recommend, but in the event that winter bean seed is difficult to get hold of this year, which is quite possible, it is an option, certainly. We've done the work the other way around, of course, where we've looked at winter beans sown in the spring, and we do see slightly more yield penalty when we do that after the end of January. So,
okay, thank you. And I've also now got a question come through WhatsApp. Could you advise a little bit about what the key learnings have been from the yen so far? So I think the bean yen is in its second year now, is it? Or is it its third year? But if you could perhaps explain what's been found so far.
Yeah, I mean, we're still at reasonable numbers, I suppose, for this year. We've had just about 40 entrants for this year. I think in conjunction with a project that we're running at PGRO as well, we're certainly starting to see that, as we talked about earlier, soil structure does have an impact on yield variability. We've had such different weather years, I suppose, that actually I think having 2 years of data is going to really help us. And we're in the process of analysing the data from this second year now with a view to having a meeting, a stakeholder meeting or the grower meeting in December, early December. So we'll know a bit more then, I think, about what the combined results of the 2 years are. We certainly have more entries this year. But I think one of the key messages for us is certainly there's a massive variation between how people are dealing with the crops and what treatments they're applying. There's big variations in terms of nutrient applications. And also we are starting to get really clear signs that soil structure is an issue on farms, and that is a factor in yield variability.
Great. Okay, haven't got any more questions currently. We'll give people a couple more minutes while I just give a bit of a wrap up in terms of the Real Results Farm in general, just for people's information, if this is your first time on the platform. There are different zones, as you might have seen. There is a specific zone for pulses, and on there we have got the results of a survey that we did earlier this year on peas and beans, just asking growers about different challenges. They've got yield tips, so just worth a quick scan through of those slides, high level information. And we don't currently have any other live events scheduled, but keep an eye on the platform because there will be more new activity coming up in the next 6 weeks, and especially towards the end of the year. So watch this space for new activity there. Have had another question come through. Thank you, Philip. Are honeybees any good for pollination?
Yes. Short answer, yes, very good. Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned the solitary bees and the bumblebees, but honeybees, there is evidence, of course, there's quite a lot of evidence that using hives in crops is really beneficial. I think the key, they certainly help pollinate, improve yield. It's important as well to make sure that they're protected from any insecticide applications that people are using. But yeah, really important, really, really good way of improving yields, I think, in beans. So.
Okay, great. I think we can wrap it up in that case if there's no more questions. So I'd just like to say a massive thank you to you, Becky, for joining us today and for putting the presentation together. If anybody does have any questions that they would like to ask Becky or PGRO, there were contact details in the last slide. You can also use the message board within the platform. I think there's one in the pulses section where you could also put your questions there and we will pass them on to Becky. So I think that just leaves me to say thank you to everyone for attending. And like I say, it will be available on Catch Up in the webinar archive in the next day or two if you'd like to go back and watch it. And yeah, all the best for hopefully what is to be a new fresh season after this horrendous year. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you. Thanks, Becky.
Thank you very much, everybody.